Shakespeare: The True Story. By Graham Appleyard. William Shakespeare was born in 1564 to middle-class Catholic parents. They sent him to school, with a bag full of books, to the school in Stratford. Whilst he was very young, aged around 5 to 7, he encountered Queen Elizabeth. She made a big fuss of the boy, as she loved children. The schooling he received and his parents fostered a love of poems and royal history. However, he often skipped school, preferring to be outdoors. He also hated school as it made out that his hero, the Queen, was bad for the country. At around 12 or 13 years of age, he found out that the Queen was at Kenilworth Castle during the hot summers of those years. So he pretended to go to school, taking his bag, as usual, but played truant instead. He went walking in the direction of the castle. Meanwhile, Robert Dudley and the Queen were hunting in the area where Shakespeare lived. The hunting hounds found the young boy and chased him to the direction where the Queen and Dudley were watching the hunt. When William ran towards them, the Queen spotted that he would fall into a dangerous area and warned him off. But the young Shakespeare was starstruck and ran away. The effort of running away had made William hot, and so when he found a pool by the river, it was just too tempting. So he laid his school bag down, took all his clothes off and went to the pool. Unknown to William, the Queen had managed to shake off the hunting party and had followed him on her horse. She was watching the scene at the pool. Shakespeare was a good-looking lad and she liked what she saw, leaving very little to the imagination. However, the Queen's horse was not interested in keeping quiet and startled William, so that he fell in the pool. The Queen, despite laughing, helped the lad out. While William dried himself off, the Queen noticed the bag and went through the contents. William had already written sonnets to her and other poems, and the Queen was very impressed. She realized he was clever and offered him the chance to get a really good education, leading to university. But Shakespeare told her about the schooling he had and saying about Elizabeth shouldn't be queen, so he didn't want any more of that because it was wrong. Instead, the Queen took him to the court, showing him off. William also looked a bit like Robert, and rumors spread around the court that Shakespeare was the love child of the Queen and Dudley. Nevertheless, William became very useful and the Queen presented him to the court entertainers. At the royal palace, Shakespeare met Christopher Marlowe, who had also been spotted by the Queen, was also offered an education. Marlowe, however, accepted, but he also wanted to be on the stage. William can be seen with the others in a picture of the Queen and Dudley dancing. Shakespeare is the one on the far left. Above him playing a fiddle is Marlowe. William Cecil also found William useful, especially when the Queen told him about Shakespeare's Catholic school. Shakespeare was a bit naive and told him all about the Catholic households that were not keen on the Queen. Cecil from that information was able to make a map of all the Catholic families in the area where Shakespeare lived. Shakespeare was also very attractive to the local girls in the Stratford area. The Queen was disappointed to find out that William had a girlfriend called Anne Whately, whose father was connected to the wool trade of his own father. Anne wasn't the only one interested in William. Catherine Hamlet was very keen on him, and there was another woman, who William thought she looked like the Queen, called Anne Hathaway, who despite being older than him was well known for her beauty. She was painted by Hilliard, much later on, showing she had brown hair. At the age of 14, William's and Anne's fathers had arranged with the old Catholic priest of Temple Grafton for them to marry. William did not mind as he loved her, but Cath Hamlet did. Catherine, shortly after the wedding, went to their house and waited for William to leave. Anne and Catherine then had a massive argument and a fight started, that left Anne knocked out. Catherine, fearing her dead, ran away. During the fight, a fire must have started and the house went up in flames. Shakespeare, who was not too far away at the time, went back as soon as he saw the mass of smoke. Anne had come around and was screaming inside the house, trapped, unable to get out. Shakespeare could not save her and she burned to death. Anne Shakespeare was buried in 1579 and her death entry in the parish register has been mistaken for Shakespeare's sister. Catherine Hamlet turned up again and wanted to marry William. Although he did not know it was her fault that his wife had died, he still rejected her. Yet Cath did know it was her fault, and guilt-ridden and rejected, she drowned herself in the River Avon. Shakespeare thus had now two deaths to deal with, and he blamed himself for both. Anne Hathaway did her best to comfort him, but it was the Queen who helped the most. He was now well in with her and could get what he wanted. Now the Queen was extremely beautiful and he was now fully smitten with her. But she also had an inferiority complex the size of Mount Everest. The Queen's shyness was however a pain in the backside for William, and try as he might he could not understand why she didn't think she was beautiful. He certainly also could not convince her she was extremely attractive. Nevertheless, he made her laugh, and she was convinced that he could tell stories and make everyone laugh. So Shakespeare wrote plays that were written about the Queen and her life, which he gathered from her and the members of the court. They also included information about the court, plus other things he heard about or knew about. These were weaved around plots that were popular, or stories like Romeo and Juliet, and of course royal history. This history was even copied by an historian of the time and published in a book. Modern historians have made the mistake that this history book came before the plays. In fact, it was the other way around. Shakespeare was also very careful to make certain that the real people didn't recognize themselves in the plays, by mixing up the stories and scattering them around the plays. Even changing the sex of the person that originally told him the story. He was also not the first writer to do this, as even his fellow actors and writers used the same technique. However, some of them used William himself for the characters' personalities. To perform these Shakespeare plays, the Queen's Men were formed in 1582, with specially selected actors all around William Shakespeare. Generally the parts were written around the actors who would play the part. So the lead part of Othello was played by the black actor in the company, because the character was black. During 1582 to 1587 they performed all the major plays set out in the order of the complete works of 1623. The texts in the final set of plays were rewritten versions, with additional material added by the acting company members themselves. Some of the original texts of these plays have survived, however they were so anti-Catholic that they couldn't be used when the final works was printed. Again, modern historians have claimed Shakespeare plagiarized these plays, since they are so like his own, but of course they are his own work. I suspect some play scripts were incomplete, so his friends filled in the gaps the best they could, while others were changed during rehearsals and after the first performance. When the company of actors either didn't think the lines worked or added new bits to them. These alterations can be seen in the text, by historians, but they are typical of both stage and screen even these days. Nobody in modern films or plays then takes the credit for them. So they are not evidence of Shakespeare not being the writer of the plays. Marlowe became his best friend, acting on the stage with him. The two men and the court musicians, plus the actors in the works list, all enjoyed rich pickings. Marlowe flunked the exams at university, but Walsingham and the Queen made sure class privilege got him the degree. Not for spying, but they liked him acting, and he developed the idea of being the official Queen's flatterer, which tickled the Queen pink, literally, as she tended to look white, due to heavy period bleeds. Shakespeare also used females on the stage. Angela and Emily Basnow and their mother Margaret Jonson had special privilege granted on them that allowed them to act on the stage. This was after the Queen found out they had done so anyway. Later in life they both had their portraits painted, Emilia in the role of Anne Boleyn and Angela by Nicholas Hilliard in 1593, aged 26. William however failed to have sex with the Queen and so resolved to marry Hathaway. He didn't have much choice as she was pregnant. All the actors went to the wedding, including Marlowe, but the Queen was kept in the dark about the marriage. Marlowe at this point fell for Anne and she became his muse. Meanwhile, Shakespeare and the Queen carried on with the Plutonic love affair. However, there was kissing. And nobody untrustworthy knew. His youthful innocence had gone, and William had mastered his sex drive and would have sex with any woman who offered it. And plenty did, with the exception of the Queen. Marlowe, however, would go to Shakespeare's house and eventually persuade Anne that William was having sex with the Queen. Anne was also highly sexed, like her husband, and they had sex together. Later on she would have sex with Emilia, who felt sorry for her when her husband was having sex with all the other women he had. Anne, however, was caught by one of William's loyal servants, who told his master. After getting angry and hitting the poor man in disbelief, Shakespeare set a trap for the lovers. He pretended to go out during the night and leave them alone. He then returned in the dead of night, to find them in the best bed together. Anger took control of Shakespeare for a short while as he chased Marlowe with a sword, after which he froze them out of his world. This went on for some time until one day in 1587 the tension between the two men explodes during a stage performance. And the two men started sword fencing for real in public. The fight was stopped and Shakespeare and Marlowe were summoned to appear in front of the Queen. It's likely that both were reluctant to say what the fight was about, but the Queen pressed hard and Marlowe snapped. By this time Marlowe had become almost rewarded with the unofficial title as the Queen's flatterer. The Queen hated flattery, but when Marlowe did it, it was so funny. Partially because he was really being two-faced with her and she did not know. So Marlowe blurted out the truth, in that it was about Shakespeare's wife. Then Shakespeare said it was about him sleeping with his wife. This made the Queen furious with them both, but especially William. He had no real defense, but Marlowe did and wasn't going to let the Queen destroy what he had built up, and made it clear that if the Queen took action on the adultery thing, he would expose her doings with a married man. So William had another fight with Marlowe and the Queen had them chucked out of the palace. The first effect was the breaking up of the Queen's men. The other actors and writers distanced themselves from the two men and put pressure on the Queen to allow them to continue. The Queen could see the point and allowed new companies to be formed. But they had to make a living that was not funded from royal patronage. Marlowe didn't care for the Queen's patronage anyway and saw this as his big break, and all the plays he wrote followed quickly. Shakespeare struggled. She made it clear he was not to write brand new plays. He sent her some more sonnets and she sent her final sonnets to him. Shakespeare then tried every trick in the book to get back in the Queen's book, even paying Hilliard to paint a miniature of him holding the Queen's hand. He tried to get the Earl of Southampton to intercede on his behalf, by paying the Earl over £1,000. The Earl was the proverbial upper-class twit and let anyone have his patronage for money. In the end it was Shakespeare's friends that persuade the Queen to let him perform and write again. However, the conditions were tough. So from 1589 Shakespeare starts putting out his rewritten plays on the public theatres. In the same year he also married another woman called Barbara Stiff. Whilst still married to Anne, they had at least 2 female children together. But Barbara died in 1610. However, it was Marlowe who got the blame for ending the gravy train. Even the nickname of Kit was probably an insult. Somebody even commissioned Hilliard to show him on fire. He was made fun of in plays such as The Shoemaker's Holiday and The Cobbler of Canterbury. Marlowe hit back at his critics by having Hilliard paint a stylistic image of himself walking through thorns. Marlowe's death in 1593 might well have been at the request of the Queen, but he had more enemies than friends, and with the exception of Shakespeare, most of the entertainment circle would have cheered at his death. The death of Queen Elizabeth in 1603 shook Shakespeare to his bones. A few knew what she had died from. Ever since the Essex Rising of 1601 and his death, the Queen had gone into a depression that no one could pull her out of. The physical effect on the Queen was to cut her food intake to near zero. Her food intake in the past was not great, and like a supermodel on a diet she starved herself to death. The most visible effect being her cheeks, Her fat reserve used up, they were so hollow she stuffed herself with cloths to fill them out. Eventually her body gave out and she would have died of the effects of malnutrition. The new king loved watching plays and things nearly returned to normal. Shakespeare wasn't much interested in writing new plays, so his output was small. James, however, had a problem. He couldn't get his queen pregnant. More than likely caused by an infection when a child. So even while Elizabeth was alive, Shakespeare had been having sex with Anne of Denmark with the full consent of her husband, as Shakespeare had got a reputation for making babies. In the days of arranged marriages, men didn't always like their wives, but Shakespeare always would oblige. Shakespeare had always drunk heavily and by 1616 was suffering from cancers caused by the abuse. In a lot of pain sometimes and fearing the worst, he made out his will, leaving only the worn best bed to his wife, because that's where he caught her. Ben Jonson and Michael Drayton apparently came to see him and he couldn't resist a drinking binge. It was his last. His liver packed in and Shakespeare went yellow and developed a high fever. Jonson, his wife and Drayton as well as Shakespeare's lawyer watched the end. It was not a pleasant one, as poisons entered his brain, making him say all sorts of things and some really nasty things too. He also spurted out foreign languages, but most of the abuse was aimed at his wife. He died in agony of liver failure. Even before the will was made, Shakespeare had destroyed manuscripts and his library of books, because he had turned Puritan in his ways. Possibly also to protect Elizabeth's reputation as well. He had already objected to the sonnets being published. Fortunately, they had already had the traces of Elizabeth's name removed from the parts she wrote. His wife, however, still repentant of her deed, refused permission for an elaborate funeral and objected to a request by his friends to publish all the works they had copies of. Eventually, when Anne Shakespeare died, the friends were able to do things the way they wanted, so they staged a big service for the man whom they loved. They had his works printed and they laid out all the actors' names in the book, except Christopher Marlowe. They couldn't mention the two actresses for legal reasons, but Shakespeare gave Emily some of his poems as a keepsake, before he decided to destroy most of them. Unfortunately, Emily lost a great deal of money and tried to make some money out of the poems, adding things herself, because Shakespeare taught her to write in his style. However, the book fell foul of the law and only limited copies were ever made. So thanks to Elizabeth and Marlowe, people now think that Shakespeare did not write the plays. However, the plays themselves hold massive clues to real history of the Tudor courts from the time of Henry VIII and what was really said in the court of Queen Elizabeth I. Text copyright Graham Appleyard 2011. Video copyright 2015. Narrated by computer-generated voice Brian 22, made by Ivona Software.